Have you ever lived your whole life in someone else's shadow, quietly wondering if anyone truly saw you? My name is Evelyn Carter. If you've ever measured your worth by the shimmer of someone else's spotlight, or held your breath so you wouldn't disrupt a perfect family picture, you might see a little of yourself in my story. Sometimes the people closest to us, our siblings, our parents, our first loves shape us in ways that linger long after the echoes of childhood have faded. My journey isn't about perfect endings or easy forgiveness. It's about finding the courage to choose myself even when it meant walking away from the only version of family I'd ever known. I grew up in a small town where everyone seemed to know our business before we did. My sister Sienna was the kind of girl who could walk into a room and have every head turn. She was golden, brighter, bolder, blessed with that effortless charisma that makes adults beam and classmates fall silent. I loved her fiercely, even when it hurt, even when her successes made me feel smaller. But love in a family like ours isn't always gentle. My parents adored us both, but it was Sienna who won the piano competitions, who got the big parts in the school play, whose report cards always came with a handshake from the principal. I learned early to take pride in being the steady one, the helper, the secret keeper traits that kept me useful, but rarely celebrated. Still, I held tight to hope. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was generous enough one day, I'd finally feel like enough. Looking back, I realize how much I silenced my own needs, how I allowed my love for others to outgrow the love I showed myself. I found comfort in small rituals, making perfect Sunday pancakes for Sienna, listening to my father's stories long after dinner, slipping kind notes into my mother's purse before big work meetings. Each act was a quiet way to belong, a way to stake out my corner in a house that sometimes felt too full of everyone else's dreams. But childhood ends, and the habits we carry into adulthood, seeking approval, fearing conflict, mistaking loyalty for love, don't simply vanish. When I met Aiden Brooks in college, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me for myself, not just as Sienna's little sister. He was funny and kind, the sort of person who noticed when your hands were cold and always offered his gloves. We built a life on small joys, shared takeout in tiny apartments, late-night study sessions, dreams scribbled on napkins during slow afternoons. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe I could be someone's first choice. I could build a future that belonged to me. But life, as I'd learned, has a way of testing what you believe about yourself. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's a whisper, a look, a secret you sense before you know. The story I'm about to share is not just about losing a fiancé or a sister's deception. It's about waking up to the patterns that kept me small and finally painfully breaking free. It's a story of heartbreak and humiliation. Yes, but more than that, it's a story about resilience, reinvention, and the kind of love that begins only when you finally choose yourself. So before I tell you how my sister stole the man I loved just days before our wedding, or how I found the courage to give her the gift she never saw coming, I want to take you back to the very beginning, to a little girl in a little house learning to measure her worth in the shadows. Because every ending, even the painful ones, starts with a story about who we are and how we learn to become someone new. Healed, I was learning that harmony often meant hiding my own needs, that being easy to love sometimes required being easy to overlook. Other kids noticed too. At birthday parties, Sienna would lead the games, and I'd help pass out slices of cake. At school, teachers praised her confidence, while I was commended for being thoughtful and polite. Once in 5th grade, my best friend Maddie confessed she was only invited to Sienna's sleepover because Sienna needed someone responsible to help clean up. I laughed it off, but it stung. The older I got, the more I realized my sister wasn't just borrowing my things, she was borrowing my friends, my opportunities, even my voice. When I did speak up, I was called dramatic or jealous. Eventually, I learned to keep my feelings to myself, a skill that would serve me both well and poorly in the years ahead. If you've ever grown up with a sibling who seems to draw all the light in the room, maybe you'll understand. There's no single moment where the balance tips from innocent rivalry to something more complicated. It happens slowly over years, one missed birthday, one overlooked achievement at a time. Sienna never seemed to notice. To her, the world was a stage and everyone else was lucky to be part of her show. Sometimes I'd catch her glancing at me from the wings, a flicker of something like guilt passing through her eyes, but she always smiled it away. She was never cruel on purpose, or so I told myself. It was just easier for everyone if I played along. One winter when I was 13 and Sienna 15, we fought over who would get the attic bedroom. It had slanted ceilings and a tiny window with a view of the snow-covered street. I'd secretly hoped for years to make it my own. Sienna found my sketchbook hidden under the floorboards, filled with designs for how I'd decorate bookcases, fairy lights, a reading nook. Instead of being angry, she laughed and showed the sketches to our parents. "Isn't Evelyn creative?" she said. But the next week, it was Sienna's bed in the attic. My parents insisted it was because she was older and needed her space. That was the year I started writing my thoughts in a journal instead of saying them out loud. Sometimes I wonder how things might have been different if I'd spoken up more, or if my parents had been able to see past Sienna's dazzle. But the truth is, patterns like ours don't form overnight, and they don't break easily either. There's a comfort in old roles, even when they hurt us. I became the reliable one, the peacemaker, the person who remembered to check on everyone else. Sienna became the dreamer, the star, the source of so many family stories. As I moved through adolescence, I tried to carve out small spaces, just for me, a corner of the library, a spot by the creek, friendships with people who saw me for myself. Sometimes it worked. More often, I still felt like a guest in my own life. It took me years to realize that my longing for approval at home, at school, even with my own friends, had become a kind of invisible script. I'd say yes when I wanted to say no, apologize when things weren't my fault, keep quiet to avoid rocking the boat. There's a certain safety in being the good one, the dependable daughter, but there's also a kind of loneliness that comes from never asking for more. I envied Sienna's boldness, her certainty that the world would love her no matter what. But I also feared becoming someone who took love for granted, who expected others to clean up her messes. The lesson I wish I'd understood sooner is this: you cannot earn your place in the sun by shrinking yourself to fit the shade. Loving people deeply doesn't mean disappearing behind them. There is a difference between being kind and being invisible, between caring for others and forgetting to care for yourself. If you're always the one smoothing things over, setting aside your needs sooner or later, you begin to wonder if your needs matter at all. My story, and the story I hope you'll take from this, isn't about blaming Sienna or my parents. It's about recognizing the ghosts in our own hallways, the old stories that tell us we must stay small, silent, or safe in order to belong. Looking back, I see those years with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the ways I let myself slip into the background for the birthdays and spelling bees and attic rooms I gave away without a fight. Gratitude, too, for the quiet strength I was building stone by stone in the spaces no one else noticed, because one day I would need every ounce of that strength. The tests ahead would demand that I finally step out of Sienna's shadow and learn how to shine on my own. If you've ever felt like the supporting character in your own life, you'll know how heavy that cloak can become. But every story, even the quietest ones, has the power to change. The ghosts of my childhood would follow me into adulthood, shaping my choices in ways I wouldn't recognize until much later. But for now, all I wanted was to believe that somewhere beyond the glow of my sister's spotlight, there was a place where I could belong, where being dependable, thoughtful, and kind was not a consolation prize, but the beginning of something beautiful. That hope, however small, would lead me into the next chapter of my life. Because sooner or later, every shadow gives way to morning. And when I finally found love beyond the familiar halls of Maple Lane, I believed just for a moment that maybe the light was meant for me too. Leaving home for college felt like a quiet act of rebellion. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't know Sienna or the Carter name. It was both terrifying and freeing to be simply Evelyn, no longer the little sister, no longer the dependable one by default. My freshman dorm was a boxy beige building on the edge of campus, with perpetually buzzing lights and the comforting clatter of strangers figuring out how to live on their own. I spent the first month learning to cook ramen on a hot plate, memorizing the campus bus schedule, and marveling at how much possibility lay in the simplest things. I joined clubs, signed up for late-night study sessions, and made friends with people who found my quiet steadiness reassuring, not invisible. It was at the campus bookstore under flickering fluorescent lights and between shelves of overpriced textbooks that I first met Aiden Brooks. He was working the register, a sophomore with earnest brown eyes and a habit of running his hands through his hair when he was nervous. I'd picked up a battered copy of Great Expectations, and when I went to pay, Aiden commented on how he'd always wanted to see London just once. There was something open and honest about him, the kind of guy who asked how your day was and really listened to the answer. Our friendship began with coffee runs and walks along the river, late-night phone calls, about family and dreams. With Aiden, I felt seen not for my usefulness but for my heart. Aiden was not the kind of man who swept you off your feet with grand gestures. Instead, he was steady and thoughtful, the one who noticed when my hands were cold and always remembered my favorite brand of tea. We studied together in the library until closing time, swapped playlists, and made each other laugh when midterms loomed like storm clouds. He came from a blue-collar family, the youngest of 3, and had learned early how to stretch a dollar and work for what he wanted. He had ambitions, too, to be a chef, to someday run his own restaurant, to prove to himself, and perhaps his skeptical father, that dreams were worth chasing. I saw in Aiden a familiar kind of longing, a hunger for belonging, and a chance to create something his own. Maybe that's why I fell so hard so fast. We built a relationship out of small acts of loyalty, him waiting for me after night classes, me cooking extra portions for his shifts, both of us saving tips and spare change in a jar marked someday. Our first official date was at a hole-in-the-wall Thai place, and we both ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. I remember thinking how easy it was to talk to him, how there were no games, just 2 people hoping to build a little world together, brick by brick. With Aiden, I let myself hope that I could finally be someone's first choice. Looking back, I realize how much of myself I poured into that relationship. Not out of obligation, but out of love, and perhaps too out of habit. When Aiden's car broke down, I skipped buying new winter boots and covered the cost of repairs. When his landlord threatened to raise the rent, I helped him hunt for a better deal, spending weekends scrubbing floors and painting walls. My dependable streak ran deep. It felt natural to give to help to shore up the cracks so he could focus on his dreams. It wasn't just about money. I helped him study for exams he was sure he'd fail, edited his essays, and cheered him on when his confidence faltered. There's a certain satisfaction in being the person someone leans on and believing your support can help them reach heights they might not reach alone. But loyalty, I've learned, can be a double-edged sword. It can feel like love, and often it is. But sometimes it's also a habit, a way to keep the peace, to feel needed, to prove you matter. I watched other couples on campus, the ones who fought and made up and fought again. I envied their confidence, the way they demanded space for their own needs. In my relationship with Aiden, I rarely asked for more than I was given. I was proud to be the supportive girlfriend, the problem solver, the person who always had his back. But I also ignored small disappointments, his missed calls, the times he'd cancel our plans to pick up extra shifts, the moments when my own dreams felt less urgent than his. My friends teased me about being too nice, about always putting others first. One night, my roommate Sophie asked, "Don't you ever get tired of being the one who fixes everything?" I laughed it off, but the question lingered. I told myself that relationships were about compromise, about giving more when the other person needed it. But deep down, I sometimes wondered what would happen if I ever asked for the same in return. The idea made me uneasy. I didn't want to be difficult. I wanted to be loved. There are couples out there who thrive on challenge, who grow stronger by pushing back against each other's sharp edges. Aiden and I were not that kind of pair. We were smooth, careful, always trying to spare each other pain. He rarely raised his voice. I rarely shared my doubts. We drifted through college like 2 boats on a calm lake, never rocking the water. And yet, as our lives became more entwined, graduations, first jobs, our little apartment above the bakery, I noticed a quiet ache growing inside me. It was hard to name, harder still to admit. I wanted Aiden's dreams to come true, but I wondered if mine mattered too. There's a difference between loving someone and making yourself indispensable to them. I see that now. My willingness to sacrifice to keep the peace to say yes instead of no became the foundation of our life together. When Aiden talked about culinary school, I spent months researching scholarships and cheap housing. When he dreamed of opening a restaurant, I emptied my savings account without hesitation, telling myself that love was an investment, and surely someday it would be my turn to dream. It's a story I see everywhere: women and men who become caretakers in their own relationships, believing that if they give enough love, will be safe, certain, and forever. But the truth is, you cannot secure someone's loyalty by erasing your own needs. Love isn't a transaction. I learned this lesson in small ways long before the big betrayals, the nights Aiden fell asleep mid-conversation, the holidays spent with his family because it was easier the way my own ambitions faded quietly into the background. Each moment felt insignificant, but they added up. By the time I realized I'd lost sight of my own dreams, it was hard to remember where they'd gone. Still, I have no regrets about loving Aiden. The years we spent together were real, and there was beauty in our partnership, cooking side by side, cheering for each other's victories, finding comfort in the routines we built. The lesson I carry now looking back is not to shame my younger self for loving deeply. Rather, it's to remind myself and to anyone listening that love flourishes best where both people feel seen and valued. Loyalty is precious, but not if it costs you your voice. If I could speak to that version of myself standing in the dim light of our first apartment, counting out bills, and believing that love required me to give everything, I'd tell her this: you deserve to be chosen, not just needed. You deserve to have your dreams honored, not just set aside for someone else's. Real partnership is built on reciprocity, not sacrifice disguised as devotion. As my life with Aiden deepened, I truly believed we were building something unshakable. I had no idea how the patterns of my past, the ones I thought I'd left behind with my childhood, were quietly writing the script for my future. In the gentle glow of those years, I didn't see the shadows gathering. But soon as love was tested in ways I could never imagine, I would learn just how much loyalty can ask, and just how much it can take. Because sometimes loving someone means trusting them with everything you have. And sometimes that trust is the very thing that leaves you vulnerable when the ground shifts beneath your feet. It's funny how easily we learn to ignore the things we don't want to see. When I look back on those years with Aiden and the growing shadow of Sienna in our lives, I see so many little moments that should have given me pause. Not the obvious soap opera betrayals, but those small, everyday signals that something wasn't quite right. In the beginning, Sienna was just my big sister, charming, generous, always eager to help. When she moved to the city for work, I was glad. It meant she'd be close by, but not so close that she could rearrange my whole life with a single phone call. For a while, having her nearby was comforting. She'd call after work, suggesting dinners or double dates, and I convinced myself her attention was a sign that she cared about my happiness. When Aiden and I got engaged, she insisted on throwing us a party at her apartment. She chose the guest list, the caterer, even the color scheme, subtle things, but ones I let her control because I was grateful for the help. "You're so lucky your sister's taking charge," my mother said. "She's always had an eye for detail." I nodded, pretending not to notice how she cut me off when I tried to suggest something different. It was just her way, I told myself. She liked things done perfectly. There were other moments, 2 moments that slipped by like pebbles into a river, barely making a sound. When Sienna offered to help us choose a photographer for the wedding, I was relieved. But when I showed her the short list I'd carefully made, she wrinkled her nose. "These are fine," she said. "But don't you want someone with a little more style?" She emailed her own list that night, complete with sample portfolios, price comparisons, and glowing reviews from friends of hers I'd never met. I let her pick partly because it was easier, and partly because I wanted her approval. Later, when the photographer complimented Sienna on her stunning energy, I felt a familiar tug of self-doubt. Maybe she really did know best. Sometimes the signs were even smaller. I remember one evening, Aiden and I were having dinner at Sienna's place. She'd made her famous lemon risotto, and the 3 of us lingered over wine long after the plates were cleared. At some point, Sienna and Aiden started reminiscing about old college parties, ones I hadn't attended. Their laughter filled the room, their stories overlapping in ways that left me sitting quietly, swirling my glass and smiling along. When Sienna reached over and touched Aiden's arm just for a second, I told myself it was nothing. She was always tactile, always warm. Later in the car, Aiden noticed my silence. "You know your sister," he said, reaching for my hand. "She's just trying to be part of the family." I let myself believe it. It wasn't that I distrusted either of them, not exactly. It was more that I'd spent so many years being the peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over, that it felt natural to ignore small discomforts for the sake of harmony. Sienna would borrow my dresses for special events, promising to dry clean them, but returning them weeks later wrinkled and smelling of her perfume. Aiden sometimes called her for advice when I was at work, asking her opinion on restaurants or recipes. "She has great taste," he said. "Why wouldn't I ask her?" I smiled and agreed, swallowing the sting of feeling excluded. Real-life friendships aren't so different. I've watched friends overlook red flags in their own relationships, a partner who flirts a little too much with their roommate, a best friend who never seems happy for their success. We all want to believe the best of those we love, and sometimes the cost of questioning is simply too high. You tell yourself, "I'm just being paranoid. If there were really a problem, I'd know." You don't want to be the jealous one, the suspicious one, the person who can't just enjoy what's good. But there were hints that my instinct wasn't entirely wrong. At my bridal shower, Sienna made a toast. She talked about how Aiden had brought out a whole new side of me, how he was the brother she never had. The room laughed, but I caught a strange glint in her eye. Aiden looked down at his plate. I pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the gifts and the laughter, the glow of being celebrated, however briefly, for something that was truly mine. Sometimes when you're used to playing second fiddle, you stop asking for a solo. You become so adept at making room for others that you shrink your own presence without even noticing. When Sienna offered to handle the catering, "Evelyn, you're too stressed. Let me take this off your plate," I let her. When she insisted on choosing the flowers, the music, even the font for our invitations, I agreed. I told myself it was about the people, not the details. I told myself it was love. The truth is, I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. I wanted to believe that Sienna had changed, that Aiden and I were strong enough to withstand any outside influence. But love isn't just about loyalty. It's also about honesty, about having the courage to name the things that make us uneasy. The hardest lesson is realizing that sometimes the things we ignore are the very things that shape our future. If I'd listened to that quiet, persistent voice inside, the one that noticed the way Sienna's eyes lingered on Aiden, just a beat too long, the way he laughed a little louder at her jokes than mine, I might have asked different questions. I might have protected my heart sooner. But I'd spent so long convincing myself that my needs were less important, that my feelings were overreactions, that I missed the chance to draw a line. The lesson I learned, one I wish I'd understood sooner, is this: trusting your gut doesn't mean you don't love or trust others. It means you also trust yourself. In every relationship, there will be moments of doubt, of jealousy, of insecurity. It's not weak to acknowledge them. It's human. And sometimes what feels like a small crack is the start of something much bigger. In the end, all those ignored warning signs added up. Each tiny discomfort, each overlooked slight became a thread in a web I couldn't see until it was too late. I thought I was choosing peace. I thought I was building love. Instead, I was laying the foundation for heartbreak. And heartbreak was coming whether I was ready or not. All it took was one night, a night I'd remember forever, for every mask to slip and every truth to be revealed. But before that night, I still believed in the story I was telling myself, that love, if you tended it carefully enough, would always keep you safe. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we keep from ourselves, but sooner or later they find a way to the surface. And when they do, the only choice left is whether you'll finally listen. There are nights that split your life into before and after nights. You replay in your mind, searching for clues you might have missed. For me, it was the Thursday before our wedding, when the city's usual glow felt sharper somehow, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had barely slept for days, caught up in the flurry of last-minute preparations. Our apartment was overflowing with wedding favors, floral samples, and checklists. But underneath the anticipation, I felt a jittery restlessness, a sense that something was about to change, though I couldn't say what. That evening, a sudden urge pulled me out of bed and into the cool air. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe it was love wanting to do something simple and sweet for Aiden one last time, before everything changed. I slipped on a coat over my pajamas and headed for his place with a bag of our favorite bakery's cinnamon rolls and 2 mugs of tea. My key, still gleaming with promise, turned quietly in the lock. I tiptoed in, humming our song under my breath, already picturing the sleepy smile he'd give me as I woke him. But the apartment wasn't quiet. Laughter floated from behind his bedroom door, a sound that should have filled me with relief. Instead, it was sharp-edged with something unfamiliar. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. What I saw will stay with me forever. Sienna, wrapped in the silk robe I'd given her for Christmas, curled up beside Aiden on the bed. Their expressions froze. Time seemed to stretch, then snap. There was no need for explanations. The tray in my hand slipped, sending the mugs clattering to the floor. For a long, stunned moment, none of us spoke. Sienna's eyes met mine, not with guilt, but with a kind of tired resignation, as if she'd rehearsed this confrontation in her mind. Aiden looked sick, his face a pale mask of regret. Evelyn, he started, but the words died on his tongue. Sienna spoke first, her voice oddly calm. You were going to find out sooner or later, she said. I didn't want it to be like this. But even then, she made no move to cover herself, no plea for forgiveness. There's a special kind of pain in seeing your worst fear realized not through angry words or wild accusations, but through the stillness of people you love refusing to deny the truth. My heart pounded, but my mind felt strangely clear. I thought of the months of wedding planning, the nights Aiden came home late smelling of unfamiliar cologne, the emergency meeting Sienna claimed she had when she canceled our lunch dates. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces fit together with cruel precision. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. Instead, I stood frozen. I saw not just 2 people betraying me, but the unraveling of every story I'd built about my life. Loyalty had always been my anchor. Loyalty to family, to love, to the future I thought I was building. In that moment, I realized how much of myself I'd sacrificed in the name of keeping the peace. Real betrayal is a quiet thief. It doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper you've ignored for too long. Aiden stumbled through, an apology voice trembling. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you, Evelyn. I still love you. I do. But the words felt thin, breakable. Sienna's shoulders tensed her own apology, half-hearted at best. You always had so much, Eve. You were the good one, the safe one. I never meant for this to go so far. It wasn't comfort. It was justification. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. Those who hurt us rarely see themselves as villains. I've read stories, maybe you have too, about people who discover an affair and walk away in a blaze of righteous fury. My reality was quieter. I sat down on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, and asked, how long the answer weeks at first became months, with a little pressing. Lies multiply quickly. The hardest part wasn't the infidelity. It was the realization that I'd given both Sienna and Aiden every opportunity to tell me the truth, and they'd chosen secrecy instead. I saw in their faces the guilt of 2 people who'd convinced themselves I'd be fine, that I'd forgive, that I'd move on because I always had before. In the days that followed, everything moved in slow motion. I packed a bag and slept at a friend's house, ignoring my phone as messages piled up. My parents called bewildered and desperate to fix things. Sienna sent long, rambling texts about fate, about forgiveness, about how maybe this was always meant to be. Aiden left voicemails, his voice breaking, asking if we could meet. I felt numb, as if I was watching my own life from a distance. The world didn't stop for my heartbreak. The wedding caterer left polite reminders about final payment. Friends texted to confirm the rehearsal time. In moments like these, you learn what kind of strength you really have. My instinct was to shrink, to disappear, to let Sienna and Aiden's choices define me forever. But something else stirred a flicker of self-respect, of anger, even that I'd allowed myself to be made so small. I realized I could either let this betrayal break me, or I could use it as the push I needed to step out of old patterns. The hardest lesson: that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation, and protecting your own heart sometimes means shutting the door to people you once loved most. A friend once told me, "You only get blindsided if you keep your eyes closed." I don't blame my younger self for hoping, for trusting, for believing that love and loyalty could shield me from pain. But I do wish I'd listened more closely to my own doubts, that I'd honored my discomfort instead of brushing it aside for the sake of harmony. Betrayal leaves scars, but it also carves out space for new beginnings, if you're willing to claim them. The night I found Sienna and Aiden together, I knew nothing would ever be the same. My life had cracked open, and all the old certainty spilled out. For the first time, I wasn't sure who I was, without the stories I'd clung to about being the peacemaker, the loyal daughter, the dependable partner. What I did know was this: I deserved better, not just from them, but from myself. In the quiet that followed the chaos, a new determination began to take root. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to who I'd been. I had spent my whole life trying to be good, to be chosen, to keep the peace at any cost. Now, standing in the ruins of those efforts, I realized it was time to choose myself. Because as much as we long for the world to make sense, sometimes it takes a heartbreak to reveal what truly matters. The next days would bring more pain, more confrontation, more tough decisions. But the girl who walked away from Sienna and Aiden that night was not the same one who'd always chosen silence. She was learning, finally, that the only loyalty that lasts is the one you show yourself. And that lesson, however hard won, would change everything about what came next. The morning after everything shattered, the world seemed quieter, almost indifferent to my pain. I returned to my childhood home with a bag over my shoulder and a heart heavier than I'd ever known. My parents greeted me with frantic hugs and worried questions, their faces etched with sleeplessness and confusion. I saw in their eyes the hope that this was all some awful misunderstanding, something that could be explained away if we just talked it out. My mother was already on the phone with Sienna, her voice rising and falling in anxious waves. My father brewed coffee, hovering awkwardly nearby, as if his presence alone might mend what had broken. When the four of us sat down together at the kitchen table, it felt less like a family meeting, and more like a negotiation. Sienna arrived with puffy eyes and a carefully rehearsed apology. She spoke of mistakes, of feelings we couldn't control, of fate and forgiveness and sisterly bonds that should never break. My parents listened, torn between anger and their desperate wish for peace. When I tried to explain how deeply I'd been hurt, how betrayed I felt, my mother reached for my hand. "Evelyn, I know this is painful, but you and Sienna are family. Family always finds a way to heal. Maybe in time you'll understand her side too." The words landed like stones in my chest. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that blood could truly be thicker than water, that a lifetime of memories might outweigh the sting of a single betrayal. But what I heard beneath her comfort was a request to minimize my pain for the sake of the family, for the sake of moving on. My father echoed her sentiment. "Honey, people make mistakes. Sienna regrets what happened. We have to figure out a way forward together. We can't let this tear us apart." It sounded so reasonable, so loving, and yet I felt more alone than ever before. What hurt most was not just Sienna's betrayal, but the slow realization that my feelings might always come second to preserving the illusion of family unity. The truth is, I think many families, especially those who pride themselves on closeness, are experts at glossing over deep wounds in the name of harmony. I remembered stories from friends who'd faced similar crossroads: the cousin whose parents pressured her to forgive an uncle's cruelty, the co-worker who was asked to keep family secrets for the greater good. The details change, but the message remains the same: don't rock the boat. Don't make it harder than it already is. For a while, I tried to do as I was told. I went through the motions, attending half-hearted conversations about how to move forward, listening, as Sienna shared her version of events, swallowing my anger, when my mother suggested that maybe I was always a little too sensitive. Each time I spoke my truth, the room grew tense, as if my pain were an inconvenience rather than a call to honesty. It's a strange thing to feel invisible, in the very place you grew up, like a ghost haunting your own life, speaking words no one really wants to hear. Looking back, I see now that my parents' reactions were not malicious. They were afraid of losing us, afraid of being the family that fell apart, afraid of the silence that might come if we allowed the truth too much room. But their fear led them to enable Sienna to ask me for the kind of forgiveness that erases consequences. I realized slowly and painfully that love sometimes asks too much, that keeping a family together at any cost is a burden no one should have to bear. It was in those days, surrounded by old photographs and memories that now felt distant, that I started to draw my first real boundaries. I declined Sienna's invitations to talk it out over coffee. I told my parents I needed space, that their attempts to minimize my pain were only pushing me further away. There were tears and awkward silences, long stretches where I questioned if I was making things worse. But in choosing myself, in insisting that my feelings deserved respect, I discovered a new kind of strength, a strength born not of pleasing others, but of honoring my own worth. Real-life families are rarely as tidy as the ones in storybooks. We love each other, yes, but we also wound each other sometimes without meaning to. I learned that forgiveness is not a shortcut to healing. It's a process that requires honesty, accountability, and sometimes the willingness to step back rather than rush in. It's not disloyal to refuse to pretend everything is okay. In fact, it may be the most loving thing you can do for yourself and eventually for those you love. One evening, my father found me sitting on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the sun sink behind the neighbor's roof. He sat beside me silent for a long time, then quietly apologized. "I didn't want to see you hurt, Evelyn. Maybe I thought if we just kept going, everything would fix itself. But that's not fair to you. You deserved better from all of us." His words didn't erase the pain, but they cracked open the door to something gentler, a family that could be honest, even when honesty hurt. That night I began to understand that family ties, if they're real, can withstand the truth. But family lies, those silent agreements to sweep pain under the rug, only make the wounds deeper. I couldn't change Sienna or my parents. I could only change the story I told myself that I was worthy of love and respect, not because I kept the peace, but because I mattered. And so, in that old house full of echoes, I started to imagine a new life, one where my needs weren't negotiable, one where boundaries were a sign of love, not betrayal. The lesson was slow to learn, and sometimes lonelier than I'd hoped. But as I began to reclaim my voice, I also began to glimpse a future beyond the ruins, a future built not on pleasing others, but on being true to myself. The days that followed were not easy. There were arguments, awkward family dinners, and moments when I doubted everything. But with each step away from old patterns, I felt a little lighter. I didn't know then what would come next, or how far my journey would take me. I only knew I couldn't go back, not to being silent, not to letting loyalty outweigh my own truth. And as the weeks turned into months, the foundation of my old life loyalty sacrifice, keeping the peace, gave way to something new. The fierce, fragile hope that comes from choosing yourself, even when it means standing alone. The time had come to move beyond survival and into the uncertain possibility of healing justice and reinvention. Little did I know my next chapter would demand more courage and more creativity than I'd ever imagined. In the days after that fateful night, something inside me quietly shifted. For so long, I had associated strength with endurance, with swallowing disappointment, smoothing over conflict, and keeping my pain invisible. But now, as the shock of betrayal gave way to a simmering clarity, I realized I was done carrying other people's burdens. It wasn't anger that motivated me at first, but a sense of justice, a need to reclaim my story after years of letting others write the script. I no longer wanted to simply survive what had happened. I wanted to bring the truth into the light. I reached out to Oliver, my cousin, who had always been the family's quiet protector. As kids, he'd been the one to chase off playground bullies and stick up for anyone who couldn't find their voice. Now, working in cybersecurity, he had a knack for solving problems that required both brains and heart. I invited him for coffee at the little diner on 5th, and for the first time told someone the whole messy story, not holding back, not protecting Sienna or Aiden with careful omissions. Oliver listened with gentle patience, never interrupting. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "You don't have to fight dirty Evelyn, but you do have the right to defend yourself. Let's make sure they can't twist the truth." Together, we made a plan not for revenge in the classic sense, but for accountability. With Oliver's help, I gathered everything I needed: emails, text messages, even receipts that showed just how long Sienna and Aiden had been crossing lines. We mapped out a timeline connecting all the moments I doubted myself to tangible proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. It was painful reliving each slight and every lie, but strangely empowering too. For the first time, I felt like an active participant in my own life. I was no longer a spectator to my own pain. Oliver's support reminded me of stories I'd heard from others who'd faced betrayal, not just romantic, but professional, familial, even friendships. So many people, when wronged, are told to be the bigger person to let things go for the sake of peace. But as Oliver pointed out, peace without truth is just silence dressed up in polite clothing. He encouraged me to take control of the narrative, to hold Aiden and Sienna accountable, not through cruelty, but through undeniable facts. We made a careful record of everything: screenshots, call logs, messages, and even Sienna's own posts about the stresses of wedding season that matched up suspiciously with the nights Aiden claimed to be working late. With Oliver's technical expertise, we set up a secure folder in case anyone tried to deny or erase what had happened. I knew I wasn't the first person to have her heart broken, but the process of putting the pieces together brought a sense of order to the chaos. Instead of spiraling in shame, I began to feel a quiet pride. I was standing up for myself at last. One night, as we finished organizing the evidence, Oliver shared his own story, how during his messy divorce he'd collected proof of his ex's financial deception, not to ruin her, but to protect what he'd worked for. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to face the truth head-on, he said. You don't owe anyone your silence, Evelyn. Especially not when your silence only enables them to keep hurting you. His words settled over me like a balm. I thought of all the times I'd chosen peace at my own expense, all the times I'd let Sienna and Aiden's needs override my own. The idea wasn't to destroy them, but to ensure they couldn't manipulate the story or cast themselves as victims. In our community, rumors could take on a life of their own. And I'd already heard whispers about how maybe Evelyn was always too sensitive, or maybe the engagement wasn't as perfect as it seemed. With my documentation, I could show what had really happened, not to punish, but to set the record straight. This was my life, my reputation, and my future on the line. In preparing my case, I realized just how many people accept injustice simply because they're afraid of seeming vengeful or petty. But justice isn't about vengeance. It's about drawing clear boundaries, about refusing to let lies stand unchallenged. I found comfort in reading about others who'd taken similar stands: the woman who confronted her workplace bully with emails and HR reports, the friend who finally left an abusive relationship after documenting her partner's behavior. Their stories reminded me that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean sinking to someone else's level. It can mean rising to your own. There was a delicate line between justice and revenge, and I walked it carefully. I confided in a few trusted friends, letting them know what had happened and why I was taking action. Their support bolstered my resolve. "It's about time someone called them out," one said. "You've always been too generous for your own good." I laughed for the first time in weeks, grateful for the reminder that I was not alone in this fight. With each step, I felt a little less like a victim, and a little more like myself. The process wasn't glamorous. It involved late nights, awkward phone calls, and the occasional wave of guilt for breaking the family's code of silence. But I kept going, motivated by the knowledge that truth is a kind of freedom. My pain was real, but so was my right to speak it aloud. The lesson I carried with me was this: Sometimes choosing justice over tears means rewriting your story not out of bitterness, but out of respect for your own life. It's not about exposing others for sport. It's about refusing to let your pain be erased, minimized, or rewritten by those who hurt you. If you've ever been told to just let it go or take the high road, remember that your healing may require you to take a stand, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. As the wedding date approached, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. I was ready not for the day I'd once dreamed of, but for something braver. I wasn't sure how my actions would be received, or what Sienna and Aiden would do when confronted with the truth. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of their anger, their disappointment, or even their attempts to paint me as the villain. I had facts. I had my own story. And most of all, I had finally chosen myself. Because in the end, the pursuit of justice is not about what you do to others. It's about what you finally do for yourself. The next steps would be hard and public and far messier than I could have imagined. But as I stood on the edge of that storm, I knew whatever happened next, I would not go quietly. I would claim my truth, and in doing so find the beginning of my own freedom. The morning of what was supposed to be my wedding dawned quietly, almost beautifully. Sunlight pooled across my childhood bedroom, touching the old posters and stacks of books that had watched me grow up. The air was thick with memories, some sweet, some bittersweet, but I woke not with dread, but with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. I went through the rituals as planned: coffee with my father, a few deep breaths at the window, my mother's gentle hands braiding my hair. But under the surface, I carried something new, a certainty that today I would finally stand in my own light. The house buzzed with guests and last-minute details. Sienna, ever the star, floated through the halls with nervous energy, her laughter echoing from room to room. She tried to catch my eye, but I kept my face calm, a mask I'd perfected over years of playing peacemaker. I could feel the weight of every choice leading me here: the forgiving daughter, the loyal partner, the overlooked sister. But today, I was none of those things. Today, I was the author of my own story. The ceremony began on time, every pew filled with family friends, colleagues, people who had known me as Evelyn the dependable, not Evelyn the avenger. I watched from behind the partition as Sienna took her place at the altar, her expression betraying only the slightest hint of uncertainty. Aiden waited beside her eyes, darting to the doors, perhaps hoping I would appear and rescue him from this script gone wrong. But I stayed hidden, letting them feel the silence of a moment too big to control. As the minister's words drifted through the air, I stepped forward not to marry Aiden, but to reclaim my own narrative. The guests turned in surprise as I took the microphone, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. I told them gently but clearly that there would be no wedding, not for me. I explained, not with spite, but with honesty, that sometimes love takes us to places we never expect, and sometimes truth demands to be seen. I revealed what I'd learned: the betrayal, the lies, the timeline that stretched further back than anyone wanted to believe. I spoke not to shame Sienna and Aiden, but to release myself from the secrets that had weighed me down for years. As I shared the evidence, messages, emails, all the small ways the story had unraveled, I felt the room shift. Gasps, whispers, the hush of hearts breaking in collective sympathy. No one interrupted. No one rushed to smooth things over. What happened next was not the dramatic explosion you might see in a movie. There were no thrown bouquets, no shouting matches. There was instead a quiet reckoning, a collective recognition that something honest was finally being named. Some guests wept. Others sat stunned, holding hands in silent support. Sienna and Aiden stood frozen, stripped of their scripts, the truth shimmering between us all. It's hard to describe the feeling of turning public humiliation into personal power. For so long, I had feared being the center of attention, feared that my pain would be too much for others to witness. But standing there, I realized I wasn't just exposing a betrayal. I was modeling what it means to claim your own story, even when it's messy. I thought of all the women and men I'd heard from in online support groups, people who had endured in silence rather than risk embarrassment. I wished in that moment that they could see me now, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to disappear. One of my aunts squeezed my hand as I sat down. "You were brave," she whispered. I believed her for the first time in years. There's a lesson in that, a lesson about courage, about the freedom that comes from refusing to let others dictate how your story is told. Real power, I learned, doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it's as simple as telling the truth and letting the world adjust. As the day wore on, people filtered out in 2s and 3s. The wedding cake sat untouched. The band played a song or two for an empty dance floor, and slowly, the house returned to quiet. Sienna and Aiden disappeared no longer. The leads in a love story, but supporting characters in a lesson about honesty and consequence. My parents were devastated, but somewhere in their sadness was a flicker of relief that the truth finally had come out. Real-life stories don't always end in triumph, but they do end in change. I walked outside that night, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and thought about all the ways I'd let myself be small for the comfort of others. Today, I had chosen to be seen not perfectly, not painlessly, but fully. That choice, more than anything, was the beginning of something new. In the weeks that followed, the shockwaves from that day rippled through my family and community. Some people applauded my honesty, others whispered that I'd gone too far. But I knew deep in my bones that telling the truth was the only way forward. I had turned the most humiliating moment of my life into a chance to start over. That night, as I finally allowed myself to cry in the safety of my own room, I realized that even heartbreak could be a source of hope. I didn't know yet where the next chapter would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt proud, not for being dependable, not for keeping the peace, but for daring to let the truth shine. The wedding that wasn't had become the first day of my real life. And as the dust settled, I began to wonder, not with fear, but with a sense of quiet anticipation, what I might build from the ashes. The journey of healing I knew would be long and uneven. But I had claimed my own voice, and that at last was enough to carry me forward. The days after my almost wedding felt strangely dreamlike, as if I were living underwater, and the world above had gone on without me. At first, I was tempted to hide away, to turn off my phone, pull the curtains, and wait for everything to blow over. But life doesn't pause for heartbreak. Messages and calls came flooding in, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. My parents fielded awkward questions from neighbors. Friends offered condolences, gossip, or advice. It was overwhelming, but also revealing. In the aftermath, the landscape of my relationship shifted. Suddenly, I could see who truly cared, who felt awkward, and who just wanted the latest piece of drama. One surprise was the outpouring of quiet support from people I'd never expected. My old college roommate Carla messaged to say, "I always thought Sienna took advantage of your kindness. I wish I'd told you sooner." Colleagues brought me coffee, left handwritten notes on my desk, and invited me to join them for lunch, no questions asked. Even my hairdresser, who'd done my trial wedding updo, texted, "I know you don't need this now, but you deserved better." Their words felt like small, warm lights guiding me through a fog of uncertainty. But there was another side, too. Some people distanced themselves as if betrayal were contagious. A few mutual friends reached out only to ask for details, their curiosity thinly veiled as concern. Others, people I'd once confided in, stayed silent or posted vague social media updates, careful not to take sides. It stung, but it was clarifying. There is nothing quite like a personal crisis to show you who's in your corner and who was only ever a fair-weather friend. I learned to stop investing energy in relationships that only ran one way. Even as I grieved, I found myself thinking about stories I'd heard from others. My neighbor, Mrs. Davis, confided that when her own marriage ended, some friends vanished overnight. It hurt at the time, she said. But looking back, I see it was a gift. I learned who my real friends were. That simple wisdom comforted me. It reminded me that loss, as painful as it can be, often strips away what no longer serves us, leaving behind something truer, if only we have the courage to see it. Social media, of course, had its own role in my ordeal. News of the canceled wedding and the truth behind it spread quickly. Some people shared supportive comments, while others speculated or criticized. For a few weeks, I became a cautionary tale, the subject of whispers at book club or side conversations in the grocery store. I hated the attention, but I also recognized its power. The story didn't belong just to Sienna and Aiden anymore. It was part of a wider conversation about loyalty, honesty, and the risks we take for love. The fallout wasn't limited to me. Sienna and Aiden became pariahs in ways neither of them expected. Friends who had once celebrated their chemistry quietly unfriended them. Their social circles shrank overnight. Some people sent them angry messages. Others simply disappeared. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Aiden lost out on a job he'd been promised, and Sienna's closest girlfriends canceled her birthday plans. Actions have consequences, I thought, not with spite, but with a measure of relief. The world might not always be fair, but sometimes it delivers poetic justice in unexpected ways. Even my family had to adjust to the new reality. My parents, who had so desperately wanted everything to be normal, found themselves fielding questions and confronting uncomfortable truths. My mother cried for weeks, mourning not only the loss of the wedding, but the illusion of our family's perfection. My father, ever pragmatic, began to call me just to chat, as if making up for lost time. Our conversations deepened. We talked about everything the past, our mistakes, what forgiveness really means. Slowly, the walls between us thinned, not because we pretended nothing happened, but because we finally allowed ourselves to be honest. There's a special kind of healing that happens when you're forced to let go of people who were never really meant to stay. It's bittersweet, a mixture of grief and relief, sorrow and freedom. I started to notice the people who showed up in small, thoughtful ways, the friend who sent me soup on a rainy day, the coworker who covered my shift without asking the cousin who checked in, just because. Their kindness didn't erase my pain, but it softened the edges, helping me believe that the world was still full of good people. A lesson I learned in those months was that life after betrayal isn't just about survival. It's about choosing who gets to walk beside you as you rebuild. We all crave belonging, but real belonging doesn't ask us to make ourselves smaller or quieter for someone else's comfort. True friends and true family will hold space for your hurt and your hope, even when things are messy. If you're ever in a similar place, wondering who to trust after the storm, look for those who make your load lighter, not heavier. Notice who calls without needing all the details, who shows up without asking for anything in return. These are your people. The ones who see you not just for what you've lost, but for what you still are. As the months passed, I found myself growing stronger. The pain didn't vanish, but it changed. It became part of the story I carried, no longer the whole of it. My world, once narrowed by heartbreak, began to expand again, one genuine connection at a time. And so in the quiet aftermath of scandal and loss, I discovered a truth I'll never forget. You cannot control how others respond to your pain, but you can choose who to let into your healing. That choice, more than anything, shaped the next chapter of my life. Because healing isn't just about what you leave behind, it's about what you dare to reach for next. In the early days after the fallout, I moved through life on autopilot. Grief has a way of draining the color from everything. Meals went half-eaten, music sounded flat, even my favorite novels gathered dust on the nightstand. But with each sunrise, the rawness softened a little. Healing, I learned, isn't a straight line. It's a meandering path full of stumbles and unexpected moments of grace. There were days when I wanted nothing more than to disappear, to curl up in the smallest version of myself. Yet there were also mornings when hope peeked through, tentative but real whispering that life could still be good. It started with the smallest acts of self-kindness. A walk around the block just to feel the breeze, making a cup of tea and actually tasting it. I began journaling again, pouring the chaos of my feelings onto the page: anger, hurt, confusion, even gratitude for the few bright spots in the darkness. Therapy helped too. Talking with someone who had no stake in the family drama let me untangle the stories I'd inherited, the beliefs about loyalty and self-worth that had shaped every choice. My therapist would remind me, you are allowed to put yourself first. You are allowed to have boundaries. It felt revolutionary and a little bit frightening. For a long time, I thought healing would mean erasing the pain, returning to the person I was before. But that's not how it works. The truth is, loss changes you. It leaves marks, but it also carves out space for something new. I started to wonder who I might become, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. That question, scary as it was, became a turning point. I realized I didn't have to be defined by betrayal or by anyone else's vision of what I should be. Reinvention took practice. I returned to work determined not to let whispers or pity change how I carried myself. My colleagues were gentle, but I pushed myself to take on new projects, leading a small team, pitching ideas in meetings, mentoring a younger coworker who reminded me of myself years ago. For the first time, I felt pride that wasn't tangled up in someone else's approval. I learned new skills, made mistakes, and surprised myself by enjoying challenges that would have terrified me before. Outside the office, I tried new things. Some were small, signing up for a painting class even though I could barely draw a stick figure. Some were big, volunteering at a women's shelter where I met people with stories of resilience that humbled me. These women had weathered storms far fiercer than my own, yet they laughed, cried, and cheered for each other without reservation. Their courage inspired me to let my guard down, to trust that community could be a source of healing instead of hurt. Real-life stories often don't offer tidy arcs or quick fixes. I still had days when grief came roaring back, passing a restaurant Aiden and I once loved hearing a song Sienna used to sing off-key. But those memories began to feel less like open wounds and more like old scars, reminders of how far I'd come. Over time, I found myself less interested in revenge, more curious about what I could create with the life I still had. One of the greatest surprises was the slow transformation of my relationship with Oliver. What began as late-night strategy sessions sharing takeout and plans for damage control evolved into genuine companionship. He became my confidant, someone who didn't just help me fight old battles, but encouraged me to dream new dreams. Our bond deepened gradually, a shared joke here, a quiet conversation there, until I realized that my heart was healing in ways I hadn't dared imagine. Oliver never tried to fix me. He simply stood by my side as I figured things out for myself. The lesson I want to share is this: rising strong isn't about becoming someone new overnight. It's about honoring each step, no matter how small, and forgiving yourself for needing time. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep showing up even when it would be easier to stay in hiding. The world rarely pauses to let us recover, but it offers second chances all the same if we're willing to reach for them. As my confidence grew, so did my willingness to hope. I began to imagine a future not shaped by loss, but by choice. I researched graduate programs and consulting opportunities, thinking maybe I could use what I'd learned not just about heartbreak, but about courage boundaries and starting over to help others navigating their own storms. My dreams didn't have to wait for someone else's permission. They didn't have to shrink to make space for someone else's light. By spring, I realized I was no longer moving through life on autopilot. The colors had returned brighter and sharper than before. I spent weekends with friends who lifted me up, built new rituals with Oliver, and allowed myself to believe in love, not just the romantic kind, but the love you give yourself when you refuse to settle for less. If you're standing at your own rock bottom, wondering how to rise, remember you are more resilient than you think. Let your scars remind you not just of what you've survived, but of the strength that got you through. Trust that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about building something honest and beautiful on top of it. As the months unfolded, I felt ready not for the life I'd planned, but for the life I would choose day by day. The old patterns no longer held me captive. The girl who once feared taking up space had learned through fire and grace how to stand tall in her own story. The next chapter was waiting, not perfect, but undeniably mine. And for the first time, I felt both strong and free enough to embrace it. As another year dawned, I found myself pausing at the threshold of something entirely new. Looking back on everything, the silent years spent in Sienna's shadow, the loyalty that shaped my love for Aiden, the warning signs I ignored, and the storm that turned my world upside down, I realized that my story wasn't just about loss or betrayal. It was about the hard, beautiful work of finding my voice. Every painful lesson, every moment of heartbreak, every act of courage and self-kindness had become a stepping stone. What once felt like the end of everything was in truth the beginning of a life lived on my own terms. With time, I learned that boundaries are not walls. They're bridges to healthier love. Saying no to those who hurt me made space for people who cherished me not because I was useful or accommodating, but simply because I was me. I stopped apologizing for my needs. I forgave my parents for the ways they missed my pain, forgave Sienna for her envy, and forgave Aiden not for their sake, but so I could finally let go. Forgiveness, I discovered, is less about forgetting and more about freeing yourself from old burdens. It is the permission slip we write for ourselves to move forward. Rebuilding was never easy. There were setbacks, awkward reunions, and moments of loneliness. But each time I honored my feelings instead of stuffing them down, each time I asked for what I needed or stood firm on my boundaries, I grew stronger. Real friendship and real love returned not overnight, but slowly and truly. My family, shaken but softened by honesty, began new traditions, ones rooted not in pretending, but in showing up as we are. And with Oliver by my side, I learned that love built on truth is not just possible, it is worth every bit of the journey. The most valuable lesson I carry is this: your story matters, even the parts you wish you could erase. Being the good girl, the fixer, the peacemaker, none of those identities could protect me from pain. But choosing myself again and again taught me that self-worth isn't given by others. It's claimed one brave choice at a time. If you've ever felt invisible, betrayed, or afraid to speak your truth, I want you to know that your voice is enough. Healing is messy and slow, but it is always possible. If you found comfort, inspiration, or even just a glimmer of hope in my journey, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with your own life? What boundaries are you learning to set? Or what dreams are you ready to chase? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want more stories about resilience, reinvention, and the gentle power of starting over, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every click, every comment, every shared story helps our community grow. We are stronger together, not because we never break, but because we always find ways to rise. So here's to loving yourself out loud. Here's to honoring your voice, your dreams, and the life that is waiting for you on the other side of heartbreak. The next chapter is yours. Write it boldly and know you never have to do it alone.